Hello everybody and welcome to our overview of chapter 13 and 14. Alright, so radio resource management. Most Cisco controllers and access points support both the 2.4 and the 5 gigahertz bands. And you can support them both at the same time if you like. In our lab, when you guys start playing with the 1250 access points, obviously you have to slide the radio in, and there's two different spots where you can put two different radios in. So you can actually put in a 2.4 and a 5 gigahertz band radio. Now, if you go into the settings menu, they have different settings for the 5 gigahertz band and the 2.4 gigahertz band. And for some reason, these are buried, of course, where you can never find them. So if you're looking for the 5 gigahertz band, you want 802.11a and AC. And if you want the 2.4, it's under B, G, and N. So it looks like this. So over here, here's the A and N. So this is the 5 gigahertz range. And then this is the 2.4 gigahertz range. So if I want to change settings in either of those radios, I have to go to the settings underneath those two headings. All right, and then once you go underneath the whatever heading you're looking for, so whether you're going under the 5 or the 2.4, like in this case we're on the 2.4, you can decide which data rates you want to support. And the data rates have three settings: mandatory, supported, and disabled. Now, if a data rate, and I think there's another, yeah, there you go, more slides of more data rates. If a data rate is supported, then the client has to support all those data rates, or the client cannot associate. Now, I'm sorry, that's mandatory. Duh. So if it's mandatory, you know what? Let me just go to this slide. If it's mandatory, the client must be able to support it, or they cannot associate with the access point. If it's just supported, a client can use the access point even if they don't support that certain rate or any or several of the rates. As long as they support one of the rates, you're good. And then obviously disabled, then the AP will not use that data rate. A lot of people turn off the lower data rates because they'd rather a client not connect at 1 megabit per second. Depending on where you're at, if somebody connects at one megabit per second, they're going to think your wireless sucks. So it might even be better to turn those off and then say, oh, they can't connect. All right, well, we could just move closer to the access point. Oh, okay, now I can connect. So depending on where you're at, my rule of thumb is I typically use 11 megabits and higher. And anything less than 11 megabits, I typically disable. But again, that's just me. All right, going through there. All right. So again, data rates, and you can say these are mandatory, these are supported. I can even disable them, that kind of stuff. But you can do that for each band, whether it's the 2.4 or the 5. All right, then your book talks about transmit power and some other stuff, and they show you poor RF radio frequency coverage. So in this case, obviously, I'm expending so much power that my signal is way outside the building or the area that I actually need to cover, because I just need to cover inside this blue line. So that would obviously be bad. I don't want to do that. Now, why don't I want to do that? Well, one, it uses power. Two, it puts the signal out in the parking lot where somebody else could grab it and that I don't want them to grab, that kind of stuff. So TCP is transmit, actually it should be TPC. Apparently I do too much TCP IP. But anyway, so it should be TPC, and that just transmit power control, and it just changes the power levels of the access point to manage the signal range. We don't want signal outside. So we're also talking about having a heat map and having everything kind of tied in together so that this stuff all works together and it knows how far the signal is going and knows when to adjust the power. All right, there's also DCA, which is Dynamic Channel Allocation. And what DCA does is, if there are two access points or two overlapping areas that are on the same channel, it will actually renegotiate one of the channels to a non-overlapping channel. All right, and finally there's Coverage Hole Detection Mitigation, CHDM. And what that does, it finds weak spots and it'll strengthen the signal by increasing the power in that area. So a lot of the Cisco wireless technology, sadly, we don't get to really play with, but it's really cool. If we had all the tools to do heat maps and put sensors in and have a complete map of the building and where the access points are and have it all hooked up to Cisco, it would be pretty amazing to see. Sadly, we don't have all that stuff. All right, so here's coverage with here's RF coverage where it's bad, and then if I turn on TPC, obviously it fixes everything so that the signal is kind of like where I need it. So I'm not wasting power. And remember, the more power you put into an access point or a controller, the hotter it gets. Obviously, power generates heat. So that'll help the longevity of your stuff. Obviously, the hotter it gets, the theoretically, the more worn out it'll get. All right, so here's where you actually assign that. So here we go to our different power levels. You can adjust them manually, or you can typically do automatic. All right, and here's dynamic channel allocation. So if I set this up like this, or I had a screwball tech that put everything on channel 1 because he didn't know any better, DCA would fix it like this so that 1 goes to 11, goes to 6. So 1 and 1 never touch each other. 11 and 11 never touch each other. 6 and 6 never touch each other. So it does all those calculations manually, or I'm sorry, automatically. Duh. All right, so again, if you got everything Cisco and it's all working neat, nice and cool, this is what they refer to, what most people call these heat maps. So they show you the areas of the signals, and then you kind of see like, oh, hey, obviously I got some issues here, that kind of stuff. So if you have this all set up correctly, the Meraki system will actually push more power to this to get a signal out farther over there. So it does some neat stuff. And I think there were some videos either last week or the week before that talked about the Spectrum Analyzer Pro and that kind of stuff, and how to do heat maps and things like that. All right, so here's another one. Here's this one. It's coming from the Cisco Meraki stuff. So again, you can see the heat map out. Again, obviously, the hotter the color, the more heat you're getting. So then the signal gets farther. It turns more bluish, blackish. And there's a big one. Woo! Nice. So if you're with a professional wireless company and you do big installations, you'll get theoretically some training on all this cool stuff. Now, sadly, most of us, wherever we're working, we're not going to have stuff like this. We're going to have like 2 or 3 access points that we put in. We're going to push a laptop around on a cart and take measurements and kind of do it like we do in class. All right, moving on. So Chapter 14, Security. So obviously wireless signals are open for anyone. You know, with a wired thing, they have to gain access to the wire, with this all on the walls and the ceilings. So it'd be relatively easy to see somebody in a business do that. But with wireless, it's open for anyone, and the range thing is kind of deceiving. You know, when we project, let's say I project just inside my building, somebody can still build a wireless antenna with a Pringles can, or whatever, however they want to do that, or Cantenna, however you want to. Actually, if you get a chance to look up Cantenna, you can see some videos on YouTube. And they can actually see your wireless signal up to a mile away or more. So when wireless was first created, apparently they had no idea that people would do bad stuff with it. So early, actually the very beginning wireless didn't seem to have passwords. Passwords weren't turned on by default. You had to actually go into your wireless router and set that. Sadly, the average homeowner had no idea what to do. And then some of those, like the early passwords, were sent in clear text, so all somebody had to do was sit there and sniff your wireless stuff with Wireshark or Ethereal at that time, and they would actually see all your stuff. So that was very bad. So early security was on the access point itself and did not authenticate to a wired server or anything like that. Even in, like, I don't say public, but in corporate wireless, the security was terribly weak. All right, then your book talks about MIC and IP. So, message integrity check. Was the frame damaged or modified in transit? So there's some kind of identifier on there that kind of gives a number. And that number can mean, hey, here's the total number of bits that there is, or here's the total number of bits that are ones, stuff like that. And that way when the packet gets to the destination can check it to make sure it has not been damaged. Now there's also intrusion intrusion protection. And that's typically like a rogue access point. So what a rogue access point is, basically somebody gains access to an office at your building that's empty for some reason, but the network jack is turned on. So what they do is they have a wireless access point that they set up, and they set the SID up so it's the same SID that you guys use at your place and that kind of stuff. And then they plug it into your network, and then as people connect to it and type in their passwords, it's grabbing all that stuff. So that's a rogue access point. They put an access point up in a business so that people will connect to it thinking that it's the actual business, and they can still connect to the business access points and stuff. And they gain your usernames and passwords. Now, they don't even need to find an office. They can actually be outside the building, not connected to your network, and be, pushing out a signal that says, hey, I'm part of the network, come connect to me. And when people try to connect and type in their username and password, they can grab that then. So rogue access points are obviously a problem. And what's kind of neat is, so there's a lot of software out there for protection, but and I don't know what Stark State uses, but if you plug in an access point into the floor jack for the internet, within 10 minutes, somebody from IT will be down saying, hey, what's going on? And then there's also active scanning. They're looking for wireless networks, and they're scanning the wireless networks. They're doing the password cracks, that kind of stuff. All right, so once these brainiacs that invented wireless realized that they needed to have some kind of security on there, they invented WEP, Wired Equivalency Protocol, and WEP was terrible. I guess when it first came out, it was okay, but within a very short period of time, they realized, oh my gosh, this is terrible. So it gave new meaning to the word Terabad. So obviously, it's the weakest authentication ever. We cracked that in class. Basically, any high school student can watch a YouTube video and crack WEP in 5 to 8 minutes, no matter how strong your key is. So the key is sent with each frame. So as long as I gather enough frames, I can pull the key out, and then I can connect and start stealing whatever I need to do. All right, now 802.1x. Now, depending on where you're looking or where you're reading, textbook, whatever, sometimes they say 802.1x, sometimes they'll say EAP. And EAP just stands for Extensible Authentication Protocol. And both of these, basically, it's not a single authentication method, but a common set of functions that other methods could use. So with 802.1x or EAP, whichever one you want to use, authentication is moved away from the access point. So the access point no longer carries that authentication information. So if somebody were to get in your ceiling and gank a wireless access point, but keep it powered, or maybe it depends if the stuff is in a ROM chip, one might be able to steal all the authentication information for everybody in your business or whoever has connected to there. But with 802.1x, it just makes the access point basically a bridge between wired and wireless, and all the passwords would be stored somewhere else, like on a Radius server. All right, so there are some EAP-based methods. So first one is LEAP, and that's lightweight EAP. And this was Cisco's early attempt to patch some of the weaknesses in WEP. So technically, you should never, ever, ever, ever use LEAP. All right, so then there's EAP Fast and Cisco-based. It's more secure than LEAP. And then there's Protected EAP, which uses certificates on the access points to verify authenticity. Then there's EAP TLS, which uses certificates on the client device and the access point. So LEAP is the weakest, and then EAP Fast, and then PEEP, and then EAP-TLS. So if you ever find yourself working for some place like a bank, or a company that has a research and development department or something like that, they should be using EAP-TLS. And then the client has a certificate to verify that they have access to that network and they are who they say they are. Each access point verifies who they say they are. And that way the clients won't connect to an unprotected access point, and the access point won't allow an unprotected client to connect. All right, now these EAP-based systems, these are authentication systems. How I prove I am who I say I am. But there's also integrity methods. Has something been changed? Has something been viewed? That kind of stuff. So the first one is TKIP, and that's Temporal Key Integrity Protocol. And that started being used with WEP. So anything that started being used with WEP or associated with WEP is weak. So the stronger one is EAS, and that's Advanced Encryption Standard. So most of your wireless access points or wireless LAN controllers will support TKIP or AES. So you 9 times out of 10 want to use AES. All right. So then obviously WPA was the first. Hey, we need something stronger than WEP. It's terrible. With WPA, the key is only sent during the initial logon, and then after that, tokens are passed back and forth. They give you authentication, but the key is not. So basically somebody has got to get your handshake in order to get the key. And then once they get the key obviously the key is encrypted, so they have to have a password file that has your key in there. And it's the same with WPA2. So the only real difference between WPA and WPA2 is WPA2 just has more advanced encryption than WPA. So it would just take longer to crack. Now, as long as you have a strong password on there, they're still never going to crack that. Even with China, it all depends on how strong your password is. If your password is purple5, they're going to crack that very fast. So WPA typically uses TKIP, and WPA2 typically uses AES. All right, so when you get a LAN controller, and you go into WANs and security. You have all the different things. Now, if it ever just says WPA, it's WPA1. It's not the 2. WPA2 always has the 2 with it. Then you can decide the encryption. Do I want AES, TKIP? Same thing with WPA2. And I think that's about it. Just make sure that you understand, how the security goes. WEP is weak, WPA is stronger, WPA2 is strongest. You understand that with WEP, the key is transmitted in every packet, where with WPA and WPA2, it only sends the key during the handshake. Make sure you know these orders, that LEAP is the weakest, EAP fast is the next weakest, then PEEP and EAP TLS. Make sure you understand that PEEP and TLS both use certificates. One uses certificates at the access point, one uses certificates on both locations. All right, that's it for me. You guys have a good one, and I'll see you in class.